Welcome to the 15th century, a time when books were so rare and expensive that owning one basically made you a billionaire. Seriously, a single handwritten Bible could cost as much as a house. A house! So if you wanted to read, you either had to be a monk, a king, or someone who had made some very questionable life choices that led you to a monastery. The average person? They got their information the old-fashioned way. Someone stood in a town square and yelled it at them. This was essentially the medieval version of Twitter, except the character limit was determined by how loud your lungs were. Enter Johannes Gutenberg. Born around 1400 inches Mainz, Germany, Gutenberg was a goldsmith by trade, a tinkerer by nature, and as history would prove, the single most disruptive human being to ever touch a piece of metal. He looked at the world and thought, what if knowledge didn't have to be hand-copied by exhausted monks who definitely misspelled things? And honestly, fair point. Medieval scribes were talented, dedicated, and absolutely human, which meant every Bible they copied had a small but non-zero chance of containing a typo that would confuse theologians for centuries. This was, historically speaking, a problem. Gutenberg's genius wasn't just the idea of printing. Basic printing had existed in China and Korea for centuries. Block printing, woodcuts, stamped ink Asia had been doing it since around 600 AD. But Gutenberg, either brilliantly or blissfully unaware of this fact, looked at the technology available in Europe and said, "We can do better." His key innovation was movable type individual metal letters that could be rearranged, reused, and pressed onto paper over and over again. Think of it like the world's first copy-paste function, except it weighed several hundred pounds and smelled like ink and ambition. Around 1440, working in secret, and we'll get to why that secrecy mattered, Gutenberg began developing his press in Strasbourg. He took inspiration from the screw presses already used for wine and olive oil, because apparently the same machine that crushes grapes could also crush the established information hierarchy of an entire civilization. By around 1450, he had a working press in Mainz. And what did he print first? The Bible, of course. Specifically, what we now call the Gutenberg Bible, 180 copies, printed between 1450 and 1455. In the context of the time, printing 180 Bibles was basically going viral. The medieval equivalent of a post hitting 10 million impressions overnight. Here's where things get interesting. And by interesting, we mean financially catastrophic for Gutenberg personally. He had borrowed heavily from a wealthy businessman named Johann Fust to fund the entire operation. When Gutenberg couldn't repay the loan, Fust sued him in 1455, won the case, and walked away with the printing press, the equipment, and the completed Bibles. Gutenberg, the man who invented one of the most transformative technologies in human history, lost everything in a lawsuit before the ink was even dry. This is the kind of story that would trend on Reddit under the title, "I invented the printing press, and my investor took it all, AMA." The replies would be brutal. Someone would definitely write, "Skill issue," but the press was out in the world now, and no lawsuit could stop what was coming. Within 20 years of Gutenberg's invention, printing presses had spread to over 24 European cities. By 1500, just half a century after that first Bible rolled off the press, an estimated 20 million books were in circulation across Europe. To put that in perspective, before Gutenberg, Europe had maybe a few 100,000 manuscripts in total, painstakingly hand-copied over centuries. Within 50 years of the press, books had multiplied by a factor that would make even the most aggressive tech startup blush. This wasn't disruption. This was an earthquake. And nobody felt that earthquake more than the Catholic Church. For over 1,000 years, the Church had been the primary gatekeeper of information in Western Europe. They controlled the scriptoriums, the monasteries, the universities. If you wanted to know what the Bible said, you asked a priest, and the priest told you what it said, in Latin, which conveniently you didn't speak. This wasn't necessarily cynical scheming. It was simply the practical reality of a world where literacy was rare and books were scarce. But the printing press changed the equation entirely. Suddenly, ideas, dangerous ideas, radical ideas, ideas that questioned authority could be copied, distributed, and read by thousands of people faster than any institution could respond. The man who most dramatically exploited this new reality was a German monk named Martin Luther. In 1517, Luther famously nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, a list of grievances against church corruption, specifically the selling of indulgences, which was essentially the medieval practice of paying money to reduce your time in purgatory. It was, to put it mildly, a scam. Luther called it a scam. And thanks to the printing press, everyone else could read exactly why it was a scam within weeks. His theses were translated from Latin into German, printed by the thousands, and distributed across the Holy Roman Empire in a matter of months. The church's PR department, had it existed, would have had a complete meltdown. This was the 16th century equivalent of a thread going absolutely nuclear. Luther didn't just post his opinions. He posted his opinions with the retweet function turned on for all of Europe. The church tried to respond. They issued condemnations. They burned books. They summoned Luther before the Diet of Worms in 1521, which sounds like a punishment in itself, but was actually a formal imperial assembly. Though Luther's expression upon arrival suggests he wasn't entirely relieved by the distinction, he refused to recant. He was declared a heretic and an outlaw. And then, crucially, he went into hiding and translated the New Testament into German in 11 weeks, using the printing press to publish it. The man understood the assignment. He'd been banned from speaking, so he handed the entire population of Germany a copy of the primary source and said, "Read it yourself." This was the 16th century equivalent of bypassing every mainstream platform and going directly to the audience. The church couldn't stop the Reformation because the Reformation was no longer a single man they could silence. It was a document, and documents, once printed, are remarkably difficult to unprint. The ripple effects were staggering and not always peaceful. The Protestant Reformation fractured Western Christianity in ways that reshaped the political map of Europe for centuries. Wars were fought. Kingdoms changed allegiances. The 30 Years' War, one of the most devastating conflicts in European history, was in no small part a downstream consequence of the theological chaos the printing press had helped unleash. When people say the press changed the world, they usually mean it in an inspirational TED Talk sense. The full picture is more complicated. Yes, it spread literacy, science, philosophy, and humanism. It also spread propaganda, misinformation, and ideological conflict at industrial scale. History, as always, refuses to be simple. But the scientific revolution now, that was something the press handled beautifully. Nicolaus Copernicus published his heliocentric model of the solar system in 1543, the year of his death. And thanks to the printing press, the idea that the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around could spread across Europe faster than the church could organize a rebuttal. Galileo built on Copernicus, published his findings, got put under house arrest for it, but the ideas were already loose in the world. You can arrest a man, you cannot arrest a printed book. Or, as the internet would eventually put it centuries later, information wants to be free. The printing press was where that principle was first truly tested, and where, against every expectation, it won. There's also something quietly profound about what the press did to the concept of authorship and individual thought. Before Gutenberg, knowledge was fundamentally collective and institutional. It lived in churches, monasteries, and royal courts. After Gutenberg, a single person with a single idea could, in theory, speak to millions. The individual voice became, for the first time, genuinely scalable. You could argue, and many historians do, that the printing press didn't just change how information was shared, it changed how Europeans thought about the relationship between the individual and authority. The Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, modern democracy, the concept of a free press, all of it has roots that run back, directly or indirectly, to a goldsmith in Mainz who wanted to make book copying more efficient and accidentally rewired the operating system of Western civilization. Gutenberg himself died in 1468, largely forgotten, almost certainly broke, having never profited meaningfully from the technology he invented. The Archbishop of Mainz gave him a small pension near the end of his life, a modest acknowledgement of the man who had, without fully intending to, set the world on fire. History has been kinder to him than his contemporaries were. He now regularly appears on lists of the most influential humans who ever lived, which is the sort of recognition that arrives about 500 years too late to pay any bills. So the next time you scroll through a feed, read a news article, share a post, watch a video essay about medieval information theory, remember that the architecture of that experience traces back to a wine press, some movable metal type, and a man who thought the monks deserved a break. The church lost control not because it was weak, but because an idea that knowledge could belong to everyone turned out to be stronger than any institution built to contain it. Gutenberg didn't set out to change the world. He set out to print Bibles and turn a profit. He failed at the second part spectacularly. The first part, though, that one worked out.